Today, we're going to discuss and explore how gender has been understood in Africa across three distinct major periods of time. Before colonialism, during colonial rule, and after independence, in a study known as Post-Colonialism. And we're going to look at masculinity, femininity, and queer identities. And we'll see how colonialism didn't just change politics or economics, but it deeply reshaped how people understood themselves and their bodies. So gender has an aspect to it that is culturally constructed. It is not universal. So it's shaped by culture, history, and power. Africa is frequently discussed using Western assumptions about gender, which leads to serious misunderstandings. Colonialism didn't just redraw maps, it disrupted how people understood who they were and how they existed in the world. Right? As many of you know, as you're in my class, in philosophical terms, gender involves both epistemology, how it is that we know ourselves, and ontology, how we are in the world. Post-colonial studies critically examines how colonialism continues to shape societies even after independence. Scholar Otto Quason describes it as an engagement with lived effects of colonialism, especially on race, gender, and identity. Importantly, it challenges the idea that Western ways of knowing are neutral or universal. Colonialism didn't only involve physical violence. It involved epistemic violence, meaning the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems. It also involved ontological violence, meaning the destruction of people's sense of being. Western patriarchy imposed new categories of gender, identity, and morality, often erasing local traditions entirely. The term subaltern refers to people who are structurally silenced, especially under colonial rule. Spivak famously asked, "Can the subaltern speak?" And her point wasn't that oppressed people literally couldn't speak, but that colonial systems prevented them from being heard or recognized as legitimate knowers, especially women. And we see this all across colonialism. It's not just specific to Africa. We see it in India, we see it in the Americas, we see it in the United States, although not as prominent. Frantz Fanon explained how colonial violence becomes embedded in everyday life. Bimbi calls this the spirit of violence. It is something that is omnipresent and normalized. And omnipresent is a word that's often associated with the Western understanding of God, right? It means all present, everywhere, at every time. Colonized people often internalize this violence, sometimes turning it inward or against each other. Gender roles were shaped within this violent structure. So, colonialism wasn't just domination. It was a reconstruction. It tore down epistemologies, it tore down ontologies, replacing them with their own epistemology and their own ontology. As V.Y. Madimbi explains, Africa was reorganized into a European conceptual framework. Indigenous gender systems were dismissed as primitive, and Western gender binaries were imposed as neutral and as civilized, as natural, universal, and civilized. Before colonialism, African masculinities were deeply communal. Men, specifically in the Igbo people, who are the largest ethnic group in Africa, were understood as providers and as protectors. Very similar to, I think, how we probably understand it today in the United States or in the Western world in general. But they were also seen as spiritually and socially interconnected beings. That interconnectedness was of importance. Masculinity was not about domination. It was about responsibility, it was about sacrifice, and it was about belonging. This being the case, colonialism replaced African masculinities with a Western ideal. As a dominant, rational, individual man. This shift disrupted communal life, and it forced many African men into exploitive labor systems, stripping them of economic and social autonomy. After independence, African masculinities didn't simply revert back. It takes time, movements, and there's a whole new system in place now that they're working through. So some African men resisted colonial ideals, others adapted, and many formed hybrid identities. Post-colonial masculinity is complex. It exists at the crossroads of tradition, colonial legacy, and modern challenges. In many pre-colonial African societies, women held significant power. Some societies were in fact matriarchal, with inheritance and lineage traced through women. Gender roles were flexible, and identity was shaped more by kinship than by a rigid biological category. That being the case, colonial patriarchy radically altered African femininity, African women were sexualized and portrayed as immoral or animalistic. Missionaries and colonial authorities sought to control women's bodies and sexuality through Christian moral codes. The Intercetera is a papal bull that was issued by Pope Alexander VI on May 4th, 1493. This gave the King and the Queen of Spain, the Catholic monarchs, King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I. It gave them the authority and the support to conquer non-Christian nations. It gave them divine authority coming from Rome. It did so by claiming that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered. This is known as the doctrine of discovery. And this provided a theological and a political justification for colonization. It framed non-European peoples as pagan and as inferior. This system directly contributed to the objectification and the subjugation of African women. Despite oppression, African women resisted. They asserted control over their bodies, challenged imposed norms, and formed movements of equality. Their resistance continues today in political, cultural, and academic spaces. A common myth is that homosexuality is un-African. In reality, many African societies recognize diverse gender identities and same-sex relationships long before European arrival. Anti-LGBTQ plus laws are often direct inheritances from the colonial legal systems. These systems that were imposed by the colonists onto the colonized. King Nzinga of Ndongo ruled as a king. He was born female and ruled as a king, not as a queen, in a matrilineal society. Other examples include female husbands, gender variant priests who held respected spiritual roles, and these identities were socially recognized, not marginalized, prior to colonial rule. However, colonizers imposed their version of Judeo-Christian moral frameworks that condemned all non-normative sexualities. They erased existent gender diversity and created a false narrative that Africa was naturally heterosexual. Edward Said explains that theories change as they move across culture. He calls this traveling theory. So queer theory in Africa is not a copy of Western theory. It's been transformed to address African histories, African identities, and African struggles. Africa is actively reclaiming its own understandings of gender and sexuality. This involves rejecting imposed binaries and redefining identity on its own terms without Western domination. So, colonialism profoundly reshaped how gender is understood in Africa. But it didn't create African gender diversity. That diversity existed long before. Decolonizing gender is an ongoing process, and it's crucial that Africa, not the West, lead this conversation. And I'll end this presentation with Frantz Fanon, who reminds us that liberation is not imposed. It is lived collectively. Understanding gender in Africa requires listening to African voices, African histories, and futures on their own terms. Thank you.